The grand hall of the Thornwood Palace gleamed under countless chandeliers, their crystal teardrops catching the firelight and scattering it across marble floors polished to mirror perfection. Alara Winters moved through the crowds of elegantly dressed nobles like a ghost, her plain servant's dress marking her as beneath notice to anyone who mattered. She balanced a heavy tray of crystal goblets filled with blood wine, the specialty blend that the higher-ranking wolves favored during celebrations. Tonight marked the 5th anniversary of King Cale Thornwood's coronation, though the whispers that followed Alara through the kitchens suggested it was more funeral than festival. 5 years since the Alpha King's wolf had gone silent. 5 years since anyone had seen him shift, or felt the overwhelming power that once made even the strongest alphas bow their heads in submission. The servants spoke in hushed tones about how their king had become hollow, ruling with cold calculation, rather than the fierce protective instinct that should drive every alpha leader. Alara had learned long ago to keep her eyes down and her thoughts quieter, especially on nights like these when tensions ran high and tempers shorter. She wove between clusters of courtiers, catching fragments of conversation that made her stomach tighten with unease. The Beta Council had grown bolder in recent months, questioning decisions that would never have been challenged when Cale's wolf still prowled beneath his skin. Some whispered that a king without his beast was no true alpha at all, that perhaps it was time for new leadership before weakness invited war from neighboring territories. Alara had no love for nobility or their power games, but something about the particular venom in tonight's gossip made her instincts scream warnings she couldn't articulate. As an Omega, she ranked lower than dirt in the eyes of most wolves in this palace, useful only for menial labor and easy to overlook. That invisibility had kept her alive through 15 years of servitude since her parents died in the border wars, leaving her with nothing but the strange gift of sight that came in nightmares she could never fully remember. The vision had struck 3 nights ago with unprecedented clarity, yanking her from sleep with terror clawing at her throat and the metallic taste of poison sharp on her tongue. She had seen the grand hall exactly as it appeared tonight, seen the king standing near the dais, where he now stood speaking with his head general, seen the blade flashing in firelight as it arced toward his unprotected back. The face of the assassin had remained frustratingly obscured in shadow, but the intention had been crystal clear in that prophetic glimpse of a future that hadn't yet unfolded. Alara had spent 3 days trying to convince herself it was just another stress nightmare, that her visions were unreliable at best, and often symbolic rather than literal. But as she watched, Cale Thornwood now, tall and commanding despite the absence of the primal power that should radiate from an alpha king, she felt the same cold dread that had accompanied her vision settling like ice in her veins. King Cale cut an imposing figure even diminished as the court believed him to be, standing well over 6 feet with broad shoulders that his formal jacket emphasized rather than concealed. His dark hair was pulled back in a style that revealed the sharp planes of his face, all hard angles, and the kind of dangerous beauty that reminded everyone he'd been a warrior before he'd been a king. Silver eyes that had once glowed with wolf-light now appeared merely human gray, but they missed nothing as they swept across the celebration with the assessment of someone constantly calculating threats. Those eyes had landed on Alara exactly twice in her years of service, both times looking through her rather than at her, confirming what she already knew about her place in his world. She was furniture, decoration, as forgettable as the wallpaper. That anonymity had always been her shield, but tonight it might need to become something else entirely if her vision proved true. The evening progressed with all the forced gaiety of courtiers pretending their king wasn't dying slowly before their eyes, measured in the absence of the beast that should share his soul. Alara continued her circuits through the hall, refilling glasses and clearing plates while staying hyper-aware of everyone who moved near the king. She catalogued faces she recognized from her vision, trying to match the shadowed figure to anyone in attendance, but the prophecy remained frustratingly incomplete. Her gift had always been like this, showing her just enough to torment but never enough to prevent. Fragments of futures that might be avoided or might be inevitable depending on choices not yet made. She had learned to hate the visions almost as much as she feared them. These glimpses of knowledge that set her apart and made her dangerous to anyone who discovered what she could do. A commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention as Lord Matthias Blackwater entered with his usual dramatic flair, accompanied by a contingent of wolves from the Northern Territories. He was a powerful alpha in his own right, head of one of the oldest bloodlines, and his relationship with King Kyle had grown increasingly strained as the king's wolf remained dormant. Matthias made no secret of his belief that strong leadership required a strong beast, and his political maneuvering had positioned him as the likely successor should Kale be declared unfit to rule. Alara watched him cross the hall toward the king with predatory grace, his smile sharp enough to draw blood, and felt her pulse quicken with renewed anxiety. This was a man who had everything to gain from the current king's downfall, who had spent 5 years carefully building alliances while Kyle fought to maintain authority without the primal dominance that had once made his rule unquestionable. The two men exchanged pleasantries that dripped with false warmth and barely veiled threats, each word chosen as carefully as moves in a chess game that had been playing out for years. Alara didn't need heightened hearing to sense the tension radiating between them, thick enough to choke on. She moved closer under the pretense of refreshing nearby drinks, her survival instincts screaming at her to stay away even as something deeper pulled her toward the danger. That was when she saw him, a servant she didn't recognize, dressed in palace livery but moving with the controlled precision of someone who'd received very different training than kitchen work. He positioned himself behind a marble column perhaps 20 feet from where Kale stood, his hand disappearing into his jacket with deliberate casualness. Time seemed to slow as recognition slammed into Alara with the force of her vision made manifest. This was the moment. This was the choice that would define everything that followed. She didn't think, couldn't afford the luxury of calculation or fear. Her tray clattered to the floor with a crash that shattered the refined atmosphere like a stone through glass, crystal goblets exploding across marble in a spray of red wine that looked disturbingly like blood. In the heartbeat of shocked silence that followed, Alara was already moving. She crashed into Kale Thornwood with all the force her small frame could generate, her hands shoving against his chest, even as she saw the flash of poisoned silver slicing through the space where his spine had been half a second earlier. They went down in a tangle of limbs and expensive fabric, and Alara's mind had just enough time to register that she'd probably signed her own death warrant before the roar shattered reality itself. It wasn't a sound that human throats could make, nor even the usual dominance challenge of an alpha wolf asserting authority. This was something primal and terrible and beautiful, the kind of power that legends were built on and nightmares borrowed from. The temperature in the hall plummeted as every wolf present felt their beasts slam against their skin in response to the command rolling through the air like thunder before an apocalypse. Alara, pinned beneath the king's suddenly crushing weight, looked up into eyes that blazed with light that hadn't existed seconds before, silver fire that promised death to anyone who threatened what was his. The beast that had slept for 5 years had finally awakened, and its fury shook the foundations of the palace itself. Kale's hands caged her against the floor, his body covering hers completely in a protective posture that spoke of instincts far older than civilization or courtesy. His wolf had erupted to the surface with such violence that Alara could see the shift trying to take him, fur rippling beneath skin that fought to contain something too powerful for flesh. Alone, the mate bond snapped into place between them with audible force, a connection so intense it stole the breath from her lungs and replaced it with certainty that rewrote everything she thought she knew about destiny. She felt his wolf recognize her on levels that transcended logic or reason, felt the beast's absolute conviction that she belonged to him, and he would burn the world to keep her safe. The king, who had been hollow, was suddenly and terrifyingly complete, and the Omega he'd never noticed before had somehow become the center of his entire universe in the span of a single heartbeat. If you're enjoying this story of awakened power and destined bonds, don't forget to like and subscribe for more supernatural romance content. Drop a comment telling us what you think is going to happen next, because this is just the beginning of Alara and Kale's journey. Chaos erupted in the grand hall as guards swarmed the would-be assassin, but Kale didn't move from his position shielding. Alara with his body. His chest heaved with breaths that weren't quite human, his fingers pressing into the marble floor hard enough to crack stone. She could feel him fighting for control, could sense through their new bond the titanic struggle happening beneath his skin as 5 years of dormant power tried to explode outward all at once. The wolf wanted to shift, wanted to hunt down every threat and eliminate anything that had dared to frighten its mate. But the man remembered he was a king, with responsibilities and witnesses, remembered that showing too much weakness, even in strength, could be just as dangerous as showing none at all. Alara lay perfectly still beneath him, her own heart hammering against her ribs, unsure if she should speak or remain silent while the most powerful alpha in the kingdom wrestled with instincts that demanded violence and protection in equal measure. When Kyle finally spoke, his voice had dropped to a register that vibrated with barely leashed power. Each word edged with the growl of his wolf. "Are you hurt?" The question came out more demand than inquiry, his glowing eyes scanning her for any sign of injury with frantic intensity. Alara shook her head mutely, too overwhelmed by sensation to trust her voice. The mate bond pulsed between them like a living thing, carrying emotions and impressions that weren't her own. She felt his relief at her safety mixed with fury at the danger she'd been in, felt possessiveness so fierce it should have terrified her, but instead made something deep in her own soul settle into place, with rightness she'd never experienced. This man was hers, and she was his, predestined by forces older than their individual choices. And her Omega Wolf was singing with joy despite the logical part of her brain screaming that this was impossible and dangerous, and would destroy whatever fragile existence she'd built in the palace shadows. Kyle rose in one fluid motion that showcased strength far beyond normal even. For an alpha, pulling Alara up with him and tucking her firmly behind his body before addressing the chaos in his hall. His voice, when he spoke to his guards and assembled court, carried the command that had been absent for 5 years, the kind of absolute authority that made even the strongest wolves drop their eyes in automatic submission. "Seize the assassin. I want to know who sent him and everyone he's spoken to in the last month. Lock down the palace. No one enters or leaves until I have answers." The Beta Council members who'd grown comfortable questioning him suddenly remembered what it felt like to face an Alpha King in full power, their beasts whimpering inside them and forcing their heads to bow despite their political maneuvering. Lord Matthias Blackwater had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating as he surely calculated how this changed every plan he'd carefully laid. The balance of power in the kingdom had shifted in a single moment, reshuffled by the awakening of the most dangerous predator in their world, and the unexpected appearance of the mate no one had known existed. The head of the King's Guard, General Marcus Stone, approached with careful deference, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered, even as he reported, "Majesty, the weapon was tipped with silver nightshade poison. If it had struck, not even your healing would have saved you." He paused, then added with something that might have been wonder in his normally stoic voice, "The Omega girl saved your life." Kale's hand found Alara's wrist behind his back, his grip gentle despite the tension radiating through every line of his body. "The Omega girl is my mate," he announced to the entire assembly, his words dropping into the sudden silence like stones into still water. "Anyone who threatens her answers to me and my wolf, and I promise you he's been sleeping long enough to have developed a very short temper for those who would harm what belongs to us." The political implications of that declaration would ripple through the kingdom for months to come, but Alara barely registered the shocked gasps and immediate whispered speculation. She was too focused on the feeling of Kale's thumb stroking small circles against her pulse point, a gesture of tenderness that contrasted sharply with the lethal promise in his voice. Through their bond, she felt his wolf pressing against his skin, demanding he take her somewhere private and safe, somewhere it could properly scent and claim the mate. It had waited for, without knowing, but the king's responsibilities chained him here for now, forced him to deal with assassination attempts and political fallout when every instinct screamed to protect and possess the woman fate had finally delivered to his door. The next hours passed in a blur of interrogations and strategic discussions that Alara watched from a chair near the throne, positioned where Kale could see her at all times, and close enough that his wolf could verify her safety without disrupting the necessary work of kingship. She learned that the assassin was a hired blade from the Eastern Territories, paid in gold that bore the mark of noble houses, but refusing to name his patron even under aggressive questioning. She watched as Cale navigated the suddenly treacherous waters of court politics with renewed authority, his wolf's presence allowing him to enforce commands that would have been debated or ignored months earlier. The Beta Council that had grown bold in his eye. Weakness now scrambled to reassure their loyalty, their survival instincts recognizing that the dormant king had become dangerous again. Lord Matthias excused himself early, citing pressing business in his own lands, but everyone recognized retreat when they saw it cloaked in courtesy. It was nearly dawn before Cale dismissed the last of his advisors and turned his full attention to Alara for the first time since the attack. She'd been fighting exhaustion for hours, the adrenaline crash, combining with the overwhelming sensations of a newly formed mate bond leaving her shaky and disoriented. He crossed to her in 3 long strides, and she noticed that his eyes still held traces of wolf light, as if his beast was too close to the surface to fully recede after years of forced dormancy. When he spoke, his voice had gentled from the commanding tone he'd used with everyone else, though power still thrummed beneath each word. "You need rest, and we need to talk somewhere private. Will you come with me?" It was phrased as a request, but they both knew it was really a test. Would she accept this bond that neither of them had chosen? Would she trust him despite his reputation and the danger that clearly surrounded his throne? Alara nodded, too tired to do anything but follow as he led her through corridors she'd only seen from servant passages, up staircases that grew progressively grander until they reached the royal wing where she had no business being, his private. Chambers were surprisingly simple compared to the opulence of the public spaces, decorated in dark woods and deep colors that felt more like a warrior's quarters than a king's palace. Cale gestured her toward a seating area near the fireplace before moving to pour 2 glasses of water from a crystal carafe, his hands remarkably steady for someone who'd just had their entire world restructured. "I owe you my life," he said without preamble as he handed her a glass. "The least I can offer in return is honesty, though I suspect you're owed far more than that." He settled into the chair across from her, close enough that their knees almost touched, and for the first time since his wolf awakened, he allowed some of his careful control to slip. The exhaustion beneath showed through, 5 years of fighting alone against a curse he'd never fully understood, maintaining power through strategy and reputation when the source of his true strength had gone silent. "I don't know why my wolf slept," he admitted quietly, his silver eyes fixed on hers with intensity that made her breath catch. "I've consulted healers, witches, seers. The best answer anyone could give me was that a curse had been placed, but no one could identify the source or break the binding. I've spent 5 years wondering if I was slowly dying, if each day brought me closer to losing my beast entirely and becoming something less than whole." His jaw clenched with remembered frustration and fear. And then tonight, in the span of seconds, everything changed. "My wolf didn't just wake up, Alara. It erupted. All because it felt your fear." The sound of her name on his lips sent warmth cascading through her chest, the mate bond amplifying every small intimacy into something profound. She took a shaky breath, knowing she owed him equal honesty, even if it meant revealing the secret she'd guarded for years. "I have visions sometimes," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Glimpses of futures that might happen. 3 nights ago, I saw the attack. I saw someone strike at you from behind, saw the blade meant for your spine. I didn't know when or exactly how, but I knew it was real. I knew I had to stop it if I could." She met his gaze despite the instinct to look away from such direct attention from an alpha. "I didn't know about the mate bond. I didn't know saving you would wake your wolf. I just knew you were going to die if no one intervened." Kyle leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell the cedar and steel scent that belonged uniquely to him. "Visions," he repeated, processing this information with the same strategic consideration he'd shown during the political crisis. "Prophetic sight is rare, especially among Omegas. That kind of gift usually manifests in alpha bloodlines." He paused, studying her face with new interest. Tell me about your parents, Alara. What do you know about your heritage? The question made her freeze because she'd spent years avoiding thinking too deeply about where she came from, about the fragmented memories of a mother who'd smelled like moonlight and rain, and a father whose eyes had sometimes held the same silver fire she'd just seen in Kale's gaze. My parents died in the border wars 15 years ago, she answered carefully. I was only 7. They kept to themselves mostly. Didn't mix much with other packs. My mother always said we were safest, staying unnoticed. She frowned, trying to access memories that had dulled with time and trauma. I don't remember much except that my father was protective to the point of paranoia, always watching the roads like he expected trouble. And my mother made me promise before she died that I would hide what I could do, that I would never tell anyone about the dreams that showed me things that hadn't happened yet. A chill ran through her as she voiced suspicion she'd never articulated before. I always assumed they died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what if it was something else? What if someone was hunting them? The look on Kyle's face confirmed he was thinking along the same lines, connecting dots into a picture that raised more questions than it answered. The timing is suspicious, he said grimly. My wolf went dormant 5 years ago. You said your parents died 15 years ago, when you would have been 7. The curse that bound my beast was complex and powerful, requiring the kind of magic that doesn't come cheap or easy. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his much larger one. The skin-to-skin contact sent sparks through their mate bond, both of them drawing in sharp breaths at the intensity of connection. I think your gift and my curse are connected somehow, threads of the same larger web. Someone has been manipulating events for a very long time, and we need to figure out who and why before they make their next move. Alara wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she was nobody important enough to be part of conspiracies involving Alpha Kings and ancient curses. But the evidence made denial difficult. Her prophetic gift, her parents' paranoid secrecy, the fact that her mere presence and fear had been enough to break through magical bonds that had resisted 5 years of concentrated effort. She was connected to this whether she wanted to be or not, and pretending otherwise wouldn't keep her safe. What happens now? She asked, grateful when he didn't release her hand, but instead threaded their fingers together in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. The whole court knows we're mates. I'm an Omega servant with no family or standing. There will be challenges. Kale's smile held dark promise, his wolf gleaming behind his eyes. Let them challenge. I've been fighting with one hand tied behind my back for 5 years, maintaining control through strategy when I couldn't enforce it through strength. That handicap is gone now. His thumb brushed across her knuckles with surprising gentleness. But you're right that being my mate puts a target on your back, especially if someone was willing to hire assassins tonight. Until we know who's behind this, you'll stay in the royal wing under guard. I know that's asking you to trust me when we're still strangers in many ways, but I need to know you're safe while we investigate. The rational part of Alara's brain pointed out all the reasons this was moving too fast, that she barely knew this man despite the bond singing between them. But her Omega wolf had no such reservations, recognizing its alpha and practically purring at the promise of protection and proximity. Besides, he was right about the danger. She'd made herself visible in the most dramatic way possible, and whoever wanted Kyle dead would see her as either a threat or a tool to use against him. I'll stay, she agreed quietly, but I want to help figure this out. If my visions can provide information, I should be part of the investigation. She caught the flicker of his wolf's immediate negative response and added firmly, I'm your mate, not your prisoner. The bond goes both ways, which means you don't get to lock me away and make all the decisions alone. The surprise on his face suggested he wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by Omegas who were supposed to be naturally submissive to Alpha authority. But then something shifted in his expression, respect mixing with what might have been relief. You're right, he acknowledged after a moment. I've been making decisions alone for so long that collaboration feels foreign, but a true mate partnership requires trust on both sides. He stood, gently pulling her up with him, and she realized just how exhausted they both were. Dawn light was already filtering through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Let's get some rest. We can strategize. Better when we're not running on adrenaline and shock. He led her to a bedroom that connected to his own, through a sitting room, giving her privacy, while keeping her close enough that his wolf could sense her presence and settle. The room was far more luxurious than anywhere she'd ever slept, with a bed large enough for 3 people, and windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Kyle lingered in the doorway, clearly reluctant to leave despite the necessity. If you need anything, I'm right. Through there. The bond will let you feel if I'm awake. He hesitated, then added with unexpected vulnerability, Thank you, Alara, for saving my life, for not running when everything changed, for giving me a chance to prove I can be worthy of a mate as brave as you. She wanted to say that bravery had nothing to do with it, that she'd acted on instinct and was still processing the consequences, but the words wouldn't come, blocked by emotion and exhaustion, and the overwhelming reality of everything that had happened in the span of a few hours. Instead, she simply nodded, watching as he finally forced himself to leave and close the door between them. Only then did she allow herself to collapse onto the bed, still wearing her ruined servant's dress, and let the tears come. They weren't entirely sad, these tears. Fear and relief and wonder mixed together, spilling out as her body finally processed the trauma of nearly watching someone die, of having her entire existence rewritten. By fate's intervention, of discovering she was mate to a king when she'd spent years believing she'd never be more than invisible. Sleep claimed her eventually, dragging her down into dreams that weren't entirely her own. The mate bond carried impressions from Kale even in rest, letting her feel the fierce protectiveness of his wolf standing guard, the determination settling into his bones as he planned how to keep her safe and hunt down whoever had threatened them. But beneath those surface, emotions ran deeper currents. She felt his loneliness, 5 years of isolation and fear that he was dying slowly while maintaining a strong front for his kingdom. She felt his wonder at having his wolf return, at being complete again, when he'd almost forgotten what wholeness felt like. And she felt his hope, fragile as spring ice, that maybe this bond could become something real and lasting, rather than just another burden of crown and duty. When Alara woke, it was to mid-afternoon sun slanting. Through her windows, and the smell of food that made her stomach growl with sudden, urgent hunger. A tray had been left on the table near her bed, covered dishes still warm, as if someone had been watching for signs she was stirring. She found fresh clothes laid out as well, simple but well-made dresses in soft fabrics that were miles above her usual servant wear. Everything fit perfectly, which meant Kale had paid attention to details most alphas would never notice about a mate they'd only just, met. The thoughtfulness of it made warmth bloom in her chest, the mate bond purring approval at this evidence of care and consideration. She'd just finished eating and changing, when a knock sounded at her door. General Marcus Stone stood in the hallway, his scarred face as stern as ever, but his eyes holding something that might have been curiosity. The king requests your presence in his study when you're ready, my lady. I'm to escort you. The title made her uncomfortable, a reminder of how drastically her status had shifted overnight. Yesterday she'd been invisible. Today, she was the Alpha King's mate, elevated to a position that would make her the target of envy and political scheming from every ambitious noble in the kingdom. Marcus seemed to sense her anxiety, because his expression softened fractionally. For what it's worth, you've earned the king's respect. That's not something easily done. He doesn't trust many people, but I can see through the bond that he trusts you. The Alma walked to Kale's private study, took them through corridors that were blessedly empty of gawking courtiers, though Alara felt eyes watching from doorways and servants' passages. By tonight, every wolf in the palace would have heard the story of the Omega girl who saved the king and woke his dormant beast, and by tomorrow, the gossip would spread through the entire kingdom. She tried not to think about the pressure of so many expectations, focusing instead on the steady pull of the mate bond drawing her toward Kale like a compass pointing north. When Marcus opened the study door, she found the king bent over a large table covered in maps and documents, his jacket discarded, and his sleeves rolled up in a way that made him look younger and less intimidating. Kale glanced up at her entrance, and the smile that crossed his face transformed him completely, driving away the cold calculation and revealing genuine warmth beneath. Ilara, good. You're awake. Come look at this. He gestured her over to the table, where she could see he'd been documenting information about the previous night's attack and surrounding events. I've been thinking about what you said regarding your parents and trying to map out connections. His finger traced lines between different locations on the largest map. The border wars 15 years ago weren't random skirmishes. They followed a pattern, targeting specific bloodlines while making it look like territorial disputes. Your parents died here, in a region that was hit particularly hard. She studied the map, trying to reconcile her fragmented childhood memories with strategic military analysis. I don't understand what that has to do with your curse, though. Even if my parents were targeted specifically, how does that connect to your wolf going dormant years later? The question felt important, like they were circling around truth, but couldn't quite see the full shape yet. Cal pulled out another document, this one covered in cramped handwriting, that looked like magical formulae or ritual notes. This is a transcription from a witch I consulted 2 years ago, one of the few who was willing to examine me closely. She said the curse binding my wolf felt like it was waiting for something, like a trap set but not yet sprung. It was dormant itself, if that makes sense, holding my beast in stasis until some trigger condition was met. Understanding began to dawn, cold and terrible in its implications. You think the curse was supposed to activate when I did something, when I came into my power, or my gift manifested fully. She looked up at him, seeing her own horror reflected in his eyes. Someone bound your wolf specifically to prevent it from responding to me, to keep us from finding each other or forming this bond. But why? What threat do we pose together that's worth 15 years of planning and murder? The scope of the conspiracy made her head spin. This wasn't simple political maneuvering or a grab for power. This was patient, methodical, and pointed at something larger than she could yet comprehend. Kale's expression had gone grim, his wolf prowling behind his eyes. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. Someone invested enormous resources into keeping us apart, which means they fear what we can accomplish together. He moved closer, his hands coming up to cup her face with unexpected tenderness. Whatever they're afraid of, we'll face it as partners. You were right last night that you're not my prisoner or some helpless thing to be protected and hidden. You're my mate and my equal, and I need your strength as much as your gift. The declaration sent pleasure cascading through their bond, her Omega wolf preening at being valued for more than just traditional expectations of mate roles. Before she could respond, another knock interrupted them. Kyle called permission to enter, and a young woman in the robes of a palace scholar slipped inside, her arms full of ancient-looking books. Majesty, I found the references you requested about prophetic gifts and bloodline magic. She set her burden on one of the few clear spaces on the table, then bobbed an awkward curtsy toward Ilara. My lady, I'm Scholar Iris Thornweave. I've been researching magical lineages for the king. Her scent marked her as a beta, and she had the slightly distracted air of someone more comfortable with books than people. There's something you both need to see. She opened the largest tome to a page, marked with ribbon, revealing an illustration that made Ilara's breath catch. The drawing showed a woman wreathed in moonlight, her eyes blazing with prophetic sight, standing before a great wolf, whose fur seemed made of starlight itself. The text surrounding the image was in an old dialect, but Iris translated with the fluency of someone who'd spent hours deciphering it. This is the prophecy of the moon marked, recorded roughly 300 years ago. It speaks of an Omega born under the blood moon, who will carry the gift of sight and the power to either save or destroy the wolf kingdoms. She glanced at Ilara apologetically. I checked the palace records. You were born during a lunar eclipse on the autumn equinox. That's sometimes called a blood moon event. The weight of destiny pressed down on Ilara's shoulders, making it hard to breathe. What does it say about destruction? What am I supposed to destroy? Her voice came out smaller than she intended, but Kale's hand found her lower back, a steady presence reminding her she wasn't facing this alone. Iris continued reading, her finger tracing the archaic text. The prophecy is deliberately vague, as they often are. It says the moon-marked Omega will stand at a crossroads where her choice will determine the fate of all shifter kind. One path leads to a new age of peace and prosperity, the other to civil war and the extinction of the great bloodlines. She looked up, her expression troubled. There's more, though. It says she will be bound to the Alpha of Alphas, the wolf whose power surpasses all others, and together they will either forge a new world or watch the old one burn. Kyle's hand tightened almost imperceptibly against her back. Alpha of Alphas. That's an old title that hasn't been used in generations. My bloodline carries the strongest alpha genetics in the known territories, but that kind of absolute dominance hasn't manifested since my great-grandfather's time. His wolf surged forward, and Alara felt through their bond the sheer magnitude of power that had returned to him. It wasn't just that his beast had woken. It was something more, something that had been suppressed by the curse, but was now flooding back with interest. Unless the curse wasn't just binding my wolf, what if it was suppressing my full inheritance, keeping me from coming into the kind of power that would mark me as this alpha of alphas? The implications cascaded like dominoes falling. If the curse had been designed to prevent both his full power from manifesting and their mate bond from forming, then someone had known about this prophecy and was trying to prevent it from unfolding. But were they trying to stop the path to destruction or the path to peace? And how would anyone even know which path their choices would lead them down? Alara found her voice, though it shook slightly. You said whoever cursed you feared what we could accomplish together. Maybe it's not about stopping the prophecy entirely. Maybe it's about controlling which version comes to pass, or ensuring the destructive path is the only option left to us, Kale added darkly. If our enemies can't prevent the prophecy, they might try to engineer circumstances that force us toward the choices they want. He turned to Iris, his voice taking on the command of a king issuing orders. I need you to find everything we have on this prophecy. Every translation, every interpretation, every mention in historical texts. And I need it yesterday. Also, pull records on the border wars from 15 years ago. I want to know who commanded troops in the regions where bloodline families were targeted. The scholar nodded and hurried out, clearly recognizing the urgency behind his requests. Alone again. The weight of everything that had been revealed hung heavy between them. Alara moved to the windows, looking out over the palace grounds as she tried to process her new reality. She'd gone from invisible servant to prophesied, savior or destroyer in the span of a day, and her brain rebelled against accepting such a dramatic shift in identity. Behind her, she felt Kale approach through the bond before his physical presence confirmed it. He didn't touch her, just stood close enough that she could feel his warmth at her back. I know this is overwhelming, he said quietly. I've had 5 years to adjust to being at the center of something larger than myself, and it still feels like too much some days. But we don't have to figure everything out immediately. One step at a time, one choice at a time. She turned to face him, surprised to find they were standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. What's the first step, then? We know there's a conspiracy. We know my gift and your power are somehow central to a 300-year-old prophecy. And we know someone is willing to kill to influence the outcome. Where do we even start? The impossibility of it all threatened to crush her. But Kale's calm steadiness provided an anchor she desperately needed. His hands came up to rest on her shoulders, grounding and reassuring. We start by learning to work together, he answered. Your visions can show us threats before they materialize. My power can protect us while we investigate. The bond between us makes us stronger than we'd be separately, which is probably exactly what our enemies fear. He brushed a strand of hair back from her face, the gesture more intimate than his words. And we start by accepting that we're in this together whether we planned it or not. The mate bond isn't something either of us chose, but it's ours now. We can let that be a weakness they exploit, or we can make it the strength that allows us to survive what's coming. Alara felt something settle in her chest, acceptance of the reality she couldn't change, mixed with determination not to be a passive player in her own fate. Then we need to test my gift, see if I can control it or access visions deliberately rather than waiting for them to come randomly. She straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. And you need to figure out the full extent of what you can do now that your wolf is fully awake. If you truly are this alpha of alphas from the prophecy, we need to know what that means practically. The approval radiating through their bond warmed her more than any words could have. Kyle smiled, fierce and proud, his wolf gleaming in his eyes. There's the mate I knew I'd find if fate ever blessed me. Not someone who needs protecting from the world, but someone willing to face it head on. He stepped back, giving her space while his attention clearly remained locked on her. Tomorrow we'll start training. Tonight, there's a council meeting I can't postpone. The Beta Council needs to be reminded that I'm back in full authority, and they need to see you at my side so there's no question about your status. He grimaced. Slightly. It won't be pleasant. Expect political posturing and barely veiled insults. But it's necessary. The thought of facing the nobles and counselors who'd spent years looking through her made Alara's stomach clench with anxiety. But she refused to let fear rule her anymore. She'd spent 15 years making herself invisible to stay safe, and where had that gotten her? Still trapped in a dangerous conspiracy she hadn't known existed, just without the power or position to fight back, effectively. At least now she had an alpha who saw her as partner rather than possession, and a bond that gave her access to strength beyond her own. I'll be ready, she promised, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Just tell me what's expected so I don't accidentally cause a diplomatic incident. Kale's laugh surprised her, genuine amusement lighting his features. If anyone causes an incident, it will be me when my wolf takes exception to how they address you. But I'll try to maintain some semblance of civilized behavior. He sobered quickly, though. The main thing is to stay close to me and don't let them intimidate you. You're my mate and future queen, which means you outrank everyone in that room except me. Some of them will test you, try to make you feel small or question your worth. Don't take the bait. You've already proven you're braver and more perceptive than any of them by saving my life when they were too busy plotting their own advancement. The afternoon passed in preparation, with servants arriving to help Ilara dress appropriately for a formal council meeting, and advisors briefing Kyle on political developments he'd need to address. She was fitted with a gown in deep midnight blue that somehow managed to be both elegant and practical. No restrictive corsets or impractical trains that would make her feel helpless. Someone had clearly given thought to what would make her comfortable while still looking the part of a future queen. And she suspected that someone was Kyle. The mate bond hummed with his approval when she finally emerged fully dressed, her hair arranged in a style that was simple but refined. "You look perfect," he said simply, offering his arm as if escorting her to council meetings was something they'd done 100 times before, rather than being their first public appearance as mates. "Remember, you belong at my side. Anyone who suggests otherwise is either ignorant or deliberately trying to undermine us." His wolf prowled just beneath the surface, ready to defend her against any challenge to her position. They walked through the palace corridors together, servants and minor nobles bowing as they passed. And Ilara tried to reconcile this new reality with the girl who'd been invisible just yesterday. The transformation felt surreal, like she'd stepped into someone else's life by accident. The council chamber was already full when they arrived, conversation dying abruptly as all eyes turned to assess the Omega, who'd somehow captured their Alpha King and broken the curse no one else could touch. Ilara felt the weight of their judgment, saw calculation in some gazes, and outright hostility in others. Lord Matthias Blackwater stood near the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral, but his scent carrying traces of frustration and barely suppressed anger. He'd clearly hoped Kale's weakness would continue, his own ascension just a matter of time. Now that path had been cut off, and he was scrambling to adjust his strategy. Kyle led her to the place of honor at his right hand, seating her before taking his own chair at the head of the table. His voice, when he addressed the assembled counselors, carried the kind of absolute authority that his wolf's return had made unquestionable. "Before we address any other business, let's clarify the current situation for anyone who missed last night's excitement." His eyes swept across the room, landing briefly on each face, and forcing even the strongest alphas to drop their gazes in submission. An assassin made an attempt on my life during what should have been a celebration. He failed because my mate, Alara Winters, saw the threat and acted to prevent it. In doing so, she broke the curse that had bound my wolf for 5 years. Some of you may have questions about her sudden elevation or her suitability. Let me be absolutely clear. She is my mate by the will of the moon herself. Anyone who challenges her challenges. Me and my wolf is very much awake now to defend what's ours. The silence that followed could have been cut with a knife, tension thick enough to choke on. Finally, Lady Celeste Ravencroft, the oldest member of the Beta Council, and one of the few who'd remained cautiously neutral during Kyle's weakened years, spoke carefully. Majesty, no one here questions the mate bond or disputes your right to choose your queen. However, some concern has been raised about security. An Omega with no known family or protection suddenly appears and significant magical events occur. You must understand why that raises questions about potential outside manipulation. Her tone was respectful but firm, and Alara could see the political calculation behind it. Celeste wasn't attacking outright, but she was giving voice to concerns others were thinking, forcing Kyle to address them directly. Kyle's expression didn't change, but Alara felt his wolf surge forward through their bond, not quite breaking. Through, but close enough that his eyes blazed with silver fire. Your concern is noted, Lady Celeste, and not entirely unreasonable, which is why Scholar Iris is currently researching Alara's bloodline and the magical implications of recent events. What we've discovered so far suggests the conspiracy goes back much further than anyone suspected, with roots in events from 15 years ago. He paused, letting that sink in. The border wars that killed so many weren't random violence. They were targeted eliminations of specific bloodlines, including Alara's parents. Someone has been manipulating events for more than a decade, and their ultimate goal appears to involve both my throne and the prophetic gifts my mate inherited. That got reactions, counselors exchanging glances and whispered conversations breaking out across the table. Lord Matthias leaned forward, his expression sharp with interest. Prophetic gifts? You're claiming this Omega can see the future? His tone managed to sound both skeptical and intrigued, walking the line between insult and genuine inquiry. Majesty, with respect, prophetic abilities are extraordinarily rare and almost never manifest in Omega bloodlines. Are you certain you're not being misled by coincidence, or perhaps by someone with an agenda taking advantage of your mate bond? Alara felt Kale's flash of rage through their connection, his wolf demanding he defend her honor with violence if necessary. But before he could respond, she placed her hand on his arm and spoke for herself, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the chamber. 3 nights before the assassination attempt, I dreamed of this grand hall exactly as it appeared last night. I saw King Kale standing near the dais. I saw a blade meant for his back. I didn't know the exact timing or who wielded the weapon, but I knew the threat was real enough that I couldn't ignore it. She met Lord Matthias's gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. You can believe me or not, but the fact remains that I saw what would happen, and I acted to prevent it. Whether that makes me a prophet or just unusually observant doesn't change the outcome. The murmur of conversation grew louder, some counselors clearly impressed by her composure, while others remained suspicious. Lady Celeste studied her with new interest, reassessing. If what you say is true, and you possess genuine prophetic sight, then your value to the kingdom extends far beyond your role as the king's mate. Such gifts could provide significant strategic advantages. Her calculating look suggested she was already thinking of ways to exploit that potential, and Alara felt a chill run down her spine. She'd spent years hiding her abilities specifically to avoid becoming a tool for others to use, and now she'd publicly confirmed them in front of the most powerful political players in the kingdom. Kyle's hand covered hers where it still rested on his arm, a gesture of support and solidarity. Alara's gifts will be used to protect our kingdom and our people, not to further individual political ambitions. His tone made it clear that was an order, not a suggestion. Now, unless anyone has concerns directly relevant to running this kingdom rather than interrogating my mate, let's move on to actual council business. The shift in topic was deliberate and forceful, reminding everyone that despite the dramatic changes, he was still their king, and they still had responsibilities beyond gossip and scheming. The rest of the council meeting proceeded with discussions of trade agreements, border patrols, and the numerous administrative details involved in governing a kingdom. Alara listened carefully, learning the names and positions of various councillors, while also noting the political alliances and tensions that showed in seating arrangements and speaking patterns. Lord Matthias led a faction that clearly resented Cale's renewed power, though they were too cautious now to express open opposition. Lady Celeste commanded respect from multiple groups, her age and experience making her a kingmaker in any serious political dispute. Several younger councillors seemed genuinely loyal to Cale, though their influence was limited compared to the established powers. Throughout it all, she felt the mate bond humming between her and Cale, carrying impressions of his strategic thinking as he navigated between factions and balanced competing interests. Being an alpha king wasn't just about strength or dominance, she realized. It was about understanding people, knowing when to compromise and when to enforce authority absolutely. Cale had been doing this for 5 years without his wolf's power to back him up, relying purely on intelligence and force of personality to maintain control. Now that his full strength had returned, he was even more formidable because he'd learned to rule with his mind as well as his beast. When the meeting finally concluded hours later, Alara felt drained. In ways that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, the constant scrutiny, the political maneuvering, the weight of expectations and suspicions, all of it pressed down until she wanted nothing more than to retreat somewhere quiet and process everything. Cale seemed to sense her state through their bond, because he cut short several councillors who tried to approach them as they left the chamber, citing pressing business and steering her toward the private areas of the palace. Only when they were safely behind the doors of his study did she allow herself to sag against the nearest wall, closing her eyes against the sudden threat of overwhelmed tears. "You did beautifully," Cale said quietly, maintaining his distance though she could feel through the bond how much his wolf wanted to comfort her physically. "I know how difficult that was, facing all those political predators in their element, but you held your own. Didn't let them intimidate you or make you feel less than you are." He moved to pour glasses of water for both of them, a simple domestic gesture that helped ground her back in reality. The fact that you admitted to prophetic abilities publicly was either brilliantly strategic or incredibly reckless, and I'm honestly not sure which yet. It certainly gave them something to think about besides attacking your background or status. Alara accepted the water gratefully, taking a long drink before responding. "I figured if rumors were going to spread anyway, I might as well control the narrative. At least now everyone knows what I can do, which means they can't accuse me of hiding powers or being duplicitous about my abilities." She managed a wan smile, though I'm sure some of them are already plotting how to use my gift for their own purposes. Lady Celeste's expression when she realized I could provide strategic intelligence was terrifying in its calculation. The memory made her shudder slightly. She'd never wanted to be important or powerful. She just wanted to survive and maybe find some small corner of happiness. Instead, she'd been thrust into the center of political machinations that could reshape their entire world. Make sure you're following along with this epic journey, because Alara and Cale's story is only beginning to unfold. Like this video if you're invested in their bond, and comment below with your theories about who's behind the conspiracy. Your engagement helps us bring you more supernatural romance content. Cale set his glass aside and finally closed the distance between them, pulling her into an embrace that felt both protective and grounding. His arms came around her securely, and she let herself lean into his strength for just a moment, breathing in his cedar and steel scent while their mate bond settled into warm contentment at the closeness. "You're not alone in this," he murmured against her hair. "Whatever schemes the council is plotting, whatever threats emerge from the conspiracy we're uncovering, we face them together. My power, your gift, and the bond between us. That's our foundation." He pulled back enough to look down at her, his expression serious. "I won't let them use you as a tool, or treat you as anything less than my equal partner. You have my word on that." The sincerity in his voice, and through their connection made something tight in her chest finally relax. She'd been so afraid that being his mate would just trade one form of powerlessness for another, that she'd go from invisible servant to political pawn without ever having real agency. But Kale seemed genuinely committed to partnership, to valuing her strength rather than trying to contain it for his own purposes. "Thank you," she whispered, then added with a hint of her returning spirit, "though I reserve the right to remind you of that promise when your alpha instincts get overprotective and you try to lock me away for my own safety." His startled laugh told her she'd read him correctly, that the impulse to shield her from danger would be an ongoing negotiation in their relationship. The next days fell into a pattern of investigation and training that left Alara exhausted, but feeling more capable than she'd ever been. Mornings were spent with Scholar Iris, poring over ancient texts and historical records while trying to piece together the conspiracy's full scope. They discovered that the border wars had indeed targeted specific bloodlines, families that carried unusual magical gifts or particularly strong alpha genetics. Ilara's parents had been part of a bloodline known for prophetic sight, their deaths part of a systematic elimination that had gone unnoticed, because it was disguised as collateral damage in larger conflicts. The question of who orchestrated it remained frustratingly unclear, though certain noble houses kept appearing in the margins of relevant events. Afternoons were dedicated to working with her prophetic gift under the guidance of an elderly seer Kale had summoned from the northern territories. Master Theron was patient but demanding, teaching her meditation techniques and ritual practices that might allow her to access visions deliberately, rather than waiting for them to strike randomly. The process was difficult and often painful, leaving her with splitting headaches and fragmented images that refused to cohere into useful information. But gradually, she began to feel more control, more ability to direct her sight toward specific questions, even if the answers remained cryptic and symbolic. Evenings belonged to Kyle, and combat training that seemed unnecessary until he explained his reasoning. "You have a target on your back now," he'd said bluntly. "Anyone who wants to control me or weaken my position will see you as the obvious vulnerability. You need to be able to defend yourself, at least long enough for help to arrive." So she learned basic self-defense, how to break holds and target weak points, how to use an attacker's size against them. Wolf hated putting her in any kind of danger, even the controlled environment of training, but he pushed past protective instincts to give her skills that might save her life. Through it all, their mate bond deepened and strengthened, no longer just an overwhelming surge of emotion, but a constant connection that let them coordinate wordlessly. She learned to read the subtle shifts in Kale's mood through their link, could feel when his wolf was close to the surface or when political pressures were weighing heavily on him. He, in turn, seemed to develop an uncanny ability to know when her visions were troubling her or when the weight of prophecy felt too heavy to bear. They fell into the kind of partnership that should have taken years to develop, compressed into weeks by supernatural connection and shared danger. 3 weeks after the assassination attempt, Alara woke from a vision so vivid and urgent that she was stumbling through the connecting door to Kale's chambers before conscious thought caught up with instinct. He was awake instantly, warrior reflexes having him on his feet with a blade in hand, before he registered that the threat was her distress rather than physical danger. "Alara, what's wrong?" His voice was rough with sleep and concern, silver eyes already beginning to glow with his wolf's protective fury. She stood shaking in her nightgown, the vision still playing behind her eyes with terrible clarity, showing her the future that would unfold if they didn't act immediately. "Lord Matthias," she gasped out, her hands gripping Kale's arms for stability. "He's making his move tonight. I saw him in the eastern gardens with soldiers bearing his house colors. They're planning to take the palace, claim you're unfit to rule, and that the mate bond has made you compromised." The words tumbled out faster as more details crystallized. "He has support from at least 3 other noble houses. They're going to strike just before dawn when most of your loyal guard are changing shifts." She looked up at him desperately. "Kale, I saw you fall. I saw him standing over you with a blade dripping black with poison. If we don't stop this now, everything we've been working toward ends tonight." The transformation that came over him was instant and absolute. The man she'd been learning to know vanished behind the Alpha King who'd held a throne through 5 years of weakness and wouldn't surrender it to treachery now. His wolf surged forward, power flooding the room with pressure that made her knees weak even as the mate bond assured her she was safe. "How long do we have?" His voice had dropped to that dangerous register that promised violence to anyone foolish enough to stand against him. Ilara closed her eyes, reaching back into the vision for details. "Maybe 2 hours until they move. They're gathering in staging points now, waiting for the signal." She gripped him tighter as another flash of foresight hit her. "There's something else. They have a witch with them. Someone powerful enough to have woven the same kind of magic that cursed you before. This isn't just a political coup. They're trying to finish what was started 5 years ago." Kale's expression went absolutely cold, his alpha authority radiating outward in waves that would have every wolf in the palace responding to the unspoken call to arms. "Then we end this tonight. Matthias and his conspirators have had years to plot their treachery. Time to show them what happens when you move against an alpha of alphas and his prophetic mate." He dressed with efficient speed, while simultaneously issuing orders through the palace mind link, calling his most trusted fighters to strategic positions. General Marcus Stone arrived within minutes, fully armed and ready for war. Lady Celeste appeared shortly after, surprisingly allied with them rather than remaining neutral as her careful political positioning might have suggested. It seemed she'd finally decided which side of history she wanted to be on. The next hour was a flurry of coordinated preparation. Guards repositioned, loyalists armed and briefed, traps set for traitors who thought they were walking into an undefended palace. Kale moved through it all with deadly precision, his strategic mind working in concert with his wolf's predatory instincts to create a response that would crush the rebellion before it could truly begin. Ilara stayed close to his side, using her gift to provide real-time updates as the vision continued to unfold and shift with their countermeasures. She saw possible futures branching and collapsing, watched timelines where they won decisively, and others where the battle became a bloodbath that weakened the kingdom regardless of victor. When Lord Matthias and his soldiers finally moved into the palace through passages they'd bribed servants to leave accessible, they walked straight into an ambush that left them no chance of victory. Kale's forces surrounded them in the grand entrance hall, crossbows trained and magical wards sealing every exit. The Alpha King stood at the top of the grand staircase with Ilara at his side, looking down at the traitors with an expression that promised no mercy for those who'd chosen insurrection. "Lord Matthias Blackwater," his voice echoed through the massive space with supernatural amplification, "you stand accused of treason, conspiracy to commit regicide, and bargaining with dark magic to overthrow your rightful king. How do you answer these charges?" Matthias had the audacity to sneer even surrounded and outmatched, his arrogance apparently unshakable. "You're weak, Thornwood, controlled by an Omega with delusions of importance. The kingdom needs strong leadership, not a king who's lost himself to mate madness." His hand moved subtly toward his belt, and Ilara felt her vision sharpen with warning. "Now!" she shouted, and Kale was already moving, his wolf erupting forward as he leaped from the staircase with supernatural speed. He collided with Matthias just as the traitor lord triggered some kind of magical device, an explosion of dark energy that would have killed everyone in the hall if Kale hadn't intercepted it with his own body. The Alpha King's wolf took the blast head-on, his supernatural resilience allowing him to absorb power that should have been lethal. But it wasn't without cost. Kale went down hard, his body smoking from the magical assault, and Ilara felt agony lance through there, bond fierce enough to steal her breath. She was running before conscious thought, sliding to her knees beside him, even as General Marcus and his soldiers swarmed Matthias and the remaining conspirators. "Kale!" Her hands hovered over him, unsure where to touch without causing more damage. His skin was burned in patterns that suggested magical corruption, and his wolf's light flickered uncertainly behind eyes that struggled to focus on her face. "The witch," he ground out through obvious pain. "Matthias isn't working alone. Find the witch before she escapes." Even injured and possibly dying, his first thought was completing the mission, protecting his kingdom. Ilara wanted to scream at him to stop being noble and focus on surviving, but she knew he was right. If the magical power behind this conspiracy escaped, they'd just face the same threat again in different form. She looked up desperately, searching the chaos for anyone who matched the energy signature she'd felt in her visions. There, in the shadows near a servant's entrance, a cloaked figure was attempting to slip away unnoticed. "There!" Ilara pointed, and several guards broke off to pursue, but the witch was already weaving another spell, reality warping around her as she prepared to teleport to safety. Without thinking about danger or her own limitations, Ilara reached deep into the well of power she'd been learning to access during her training. Her prophetic gift wasn't meant to be used offensively, but prophecy was just one application of a broader magical sensitivity that connected her to fate and possibility. She threw her awareness forward, finding the threads of potential futures and yanking hard on the ones where the witch failed to escape. Reality stuttered and reshuffled, probability collapsing in directions Ilara consciously chose for perhaps the first time. The witch's teleportation spell misfired spectacularly, dumping her back into the physical world 10 feet from where she'd started, directly into the path of Lady Celeste, who proved she hadn't survived decades of political intrigue by being helpless. The older woman's blade found the witch's throat before another spell could be cast, ending the magical threat with ruthless efficiency. Ilara swayed with exhaustion from the unprecedented use of her power, but she forced herself to turn back to Kale. His breathing had become labored, his wolf's healing struggling against corruption that was specifically designed to kill Alpha. "Shifters, stay with me," she demanded, her hands finally settling on his chest, as if she could physically hold him to life through will alone. "You don't get to die now. Not after everything we've survived. I won't allow it." The mate bond between them pulsed frantically, her desperation pouring through it along with every ounce of love and determination she possessed. She'd just started learning who he was beneath the crown and the responsibilities. She'd just begun to imagine what their future could look like. Fate couldn't be cruel enough to take him away now. Something shifted in the bond, her Omega wolf rising up with fierce protective instinct that transcended normal limitations. Omegas were meant to heal and nurture, their gifts subtle compared to alpha dominance or beta versatility. But a true mate connection amplified everything, and right now Ilara's entire being focused on one single purpose: keeping her alpha alive. Power flowed through her that she hadn't known she possessed, lunar magic responding to her need and channeling through the mate bond directly into Kale's damaged body. She felt his wolf catch hold of that lifeline, using her strength to bolster his own failing healing, burning away corruption with purifying moonlight that owed nothing to learned magic and everything to the primal bonds that connected true mates. The transformation was visible, burns fading, and breath steadying as minutes passed that felt like hours. Finally, Kale's eyes focused, on her face with full awareness, wonder replacing the pain that had clouded his gaze. "Ilara, what did you do?" His hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the violence they'd just survived. She laughed shakily, relief making her giddy. "Apparently I can channel healing through our bond when properly motivated by terror of losing you. Master Theron is going to be insufferable when he finds out I manifested a completely different aspect of my gift during a crisis." The joke fell, flat as exhaustion crashed through her, using that much power having drained her reserves completely. She felt herself tilting sideways, consciousness threatening to slip away now that the immediate danger had passed. Kale caught her before she could collapse, pulling her against his chest and wrapping his arms around her with fierce protectiveness. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "You saved me again. My brave, powerful mate who keeps dragging me back from death." His wolf rumbled, contentment through their bond, satisfied that both halves of their mated pair had survived. Around them, the grand hall had been secured, traitors subdued and order restored. The conspiracy that had threatened them had been broken, at least this immediate iteration of it. But Kale and Ilara both knew this was only one battle in a longer war. The prophecy still loomed over them. Choices still waited to be made that would determine the fate of all shifter kind. The aftermath of Matthias's failed coup took weeks to fully resolve, trials and executions of those who'd betrayed their kingdom leaving the political landscape dramatically reshuffled. Lord Matthias himself faced the Alpha King's justice with all the arrogance that had been his downfall, refusing to name his co-conspirators, or show remorse even when sentenced to death. The witch they'd captured proved more useful, her interrogation revealing connections to a network of magical practitioners who'd been working for decades to manipulate shifter politics toward some larger goal. She didn't know the ultimate endgame, being merely a hired tool, but her testimony provided leads that Kale's investigators were still following months later. Lady Celeste emerged as the unexpected hero of the night, her decisive action against the witch earning her Kale's trust and securing her position as his primary political advisor. She proved to be invaluable in the delicate work of rebuilding the Beta Council with members who were either genuinely loyal or at least too pragmatic to attempt another coup. The old power structures that had enabled Matthias's conspiracy were systematically dismantled, replaced with reforms that distributed authority more broadly and created accountability that hadn't existed before. It was the kind of transformation that would have been impossible without crisis forcing change. And Kyle used the opportunity to reshape his government into something more stable and just. For Alara, the transition from invisible servant to queen in training proved more challenging than she'd anticipated. Lessons in protocol and diplomacy filled her days, learning all the unwritten rules that governed interactions between nobles and the proper way to address foreign dignitaries. She hated most of it, the artificial courtesy and performative grace, feeling like another kind of cage after years of servants' anonymity. But she persevered, because she understood that being Kale's mate meant being his partner in rule, not just in their private relationship. The kingdom needed a queen who could navigate political waters as skillfully as she could channel prophetic visions. And Alara was determined to rise to that challenge. Her gift continued to develop in unexpected ways. The healing she'd channeled during Kyle's injury, opening doors to aspects of power she'd never known existed. Master Theron theorized that prophetic sight was just the most visible manifestation of a deeper connection to fate and possibility, and that true mastery involved learning to shape outcomes, rather than merely observing them. The implications were staggering, and more than a little frightening. If Alara could actually influence which futures came to pass rather than just seeing them, that made her potentially the most powerful person in the kingdom in ways that had nothing to do with rank or authority. It was exactly the kind of power that would make her a target for anyone seeking to control the prophecy's ultimate resolution. 6 months after the assassination attempt that had changed everything, Kale and Alara stood together on a palace balcony overlooking the kingdom's capital city, spread out below them in the golden light of sunset. Tomorrow, they would formally complete their mate bond in a public ceremony that would make her his queen-in-law as well as in spirit, binding their lives together before all their people. Tonight was their last evening of relative privacy before duty, and tradition consumed their attention entirely. Kale's arm was warm around her waist, his presence solid and reassuring at her back, as they watched their kingdom settling into twilight peace. "Do you ever regret how fast everything happened?" Kale asked quietly, his breath warm against her ear. "We went from strangers to mates, to partners ruling a kingdom in the span of months. You never had time to choose any of this deliberately." It was a question he'd asked before in different forms. His worry, that she felt trapped by fate's intervention, a recurring theme in their conversations. Alara leaned back against him more firmly, letting their bond carry her absolute certainty. "I regret that we couldn't have met under easier circumstances. I regret the danger and the conspiracy and the weight of prophecy on our shoulders. But I don't regret you, or us, or this bond that neither of us chose but both of us have chosen to honor." She turned in his arms, so she could look up at his face, seeing the love and devotion there that still sometimes took her breath away. This powerful alpha who could command armies and terrify his enemies with a glance looked at her like she was his entire world. "The prophecy says I'll stand at a crossroads and my choice will determine everything that follows." But the real choice wasn't about destruction or salvation of the kingdom. It was about whether I'd embrace this bond and fight for our future together, or let fear make me run from something that felt too big and too intense to be real. She reached up to cup his face, her thumb brushing across his cheekbone. "I choose you, Kyle. I choose us. Every day I wake up and make that choice again, and I'll keep choosing it for as long as we both live." His kiss was gentle, despite the passion that burned through their bond, a promise and a claiming, and a benediction all at once. When he pulled back, his eyes were glowing with his wolf's approval and his own emotional response to her declaration. Then, "Tomorrow we'll make it official before the moon in the kingdom. You'll be my queen, my mate, and my partner in everything that comes next." His expression grew more serious. "And there will be challenges ahead. The conspiracy we uncovered was just one branch of something larger. There are still enemies working in shadows, still pieces of the prophecy we don't understand. The crossroads you saw hasn't been reached yet." Ilara nodded, having reached the same conclusion through her ongoing visions. "I know, but whatever comes, we face it together with all the strength our bond provides. Your power, my gift, and the love we've built despite destiny trying to keep us apart. That's our foundation, and I believe it's strong enough to weather whatever storms are waiting." She smiled with more confidence than she'd thought possible 6 months ago. "Besides, we've already changed fate once by breaking your curse and surviving assassination attempts. What's rewriting one more prophecy, compared to everything we've already accomplished?" His laugh was warm and genuine. The sound she'd learned meant he was truly happy, rather than just satisfied. "When you put it that way, reforming the kingdom and averting apocalyptic prophecies sounds almost reasonable." He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers in a gesture of intimacy that never failed to make her heart race. "Thank you, Ilara, for saving my life, for waking my wolf, for choosing me despite all the complications. That came with it, for being brave enough to stand beside me when you could have asked for the safety of obscurity." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "For teaching me that strength isn't just about power or dominance, but about partnership and trust, and letting someone else see your vulnerabilities. Right back at you," she whispered, her eyes stinging with happy tears. "For seeing me when I'd spent years being invisible. For valuing my strength instead of trying to contain it. For being the partner I didn't know I needed, and the mate I never thought I'd have." They stood like that as the sun finished setting, and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Two souls bound together by fate and choice in equal measure, ready to face whatever future they would forge together. The prophecy might have set them on this path, but how they walked it would be determined by their own decisions, made together as true partners. And that, more than any vision or ancient prediction, gave Ilara hope that they could find the path to salvation rather than destruction, could build the new age of peace rather than watch the old world burn. Epilogue. 3 years later, the nursery glowed with soft moonlight filtering through gauze curtains, illuminating the crib where their daughter slept peacefully. Ilara stood watching the rise and fall of Tiny Chest, still amazed that she and Cale had created this perfect small person. Arya Thornwood had inherited her father's silver eyes and her mother's prophetic gift, the latter manifesting disturbingly early in dreams that made the infant laugh or cry with visions only she could see. Master Theron assured them it was normal for children born of powerful bloodlines, but it still made Ilara's heart ache to know her daughter would carry the same burden she'd struggled with all her life. Cale's arm slid around her waist from behind, his familiar presence settling her worried thoughts. "She's fine," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her. Temple, strong and healthy, and probably dreaming about butterflies or milk rather than apocalyptic prophecies. His gentle teasing made her smile despite her concerns. Parenthood had softened some of his harder edges, while somehow making him even more formidable as a ruler. The king who'd once ruled through fear and strength now led with wisdom and compassion, though his wolf remained ready to defend his family and kingdom with lethal efficiency when threatened. The prophecy had finally revealed its true meaning 2 years after their mating ceremony, when Ilara's gift had shown her the real crossroads approaching. The choice hadn't been about kingdoms or wars, but about how they would raise the next generation of shifters. Would they perpetuate the old hierarchies and power structures that had enabled so much abuse and conspiracy, or would they forge something new? Ilara and Cale had chosen transformation, implementing sweeping reforms that elevated omegas and betas, limited the absolute authority of alpha bloodlines, and created systems of justice that applied equally regardless of rank. The changes had been met with resistance from traditionalists, but the prophecy's promise of prosperity had proven accurate as their kingdom flourished under more equitable governance. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of those early days?" Alara asked softly, careful not to wake Arya. "When it was just us figuring out the mate bond and trying to survive assassination attempts?" Kale's laugh rumbled through his chest into her back. "No. Well, maybe the part where we didn't have diplomatic meetings at dawn and trade negotiations that last 8 hours. But not the constant danger or uncertainty." He turned her in his arms so he could look down at her face. "I like this life we've built. The reforms are working. The kingdom is stronger than it's been in generations. And we have a daughter who will grow up in a world where her worth isn't determined by whether she's alpha, beta, or omega." His smile turned wicked. "Plus, I've gotten very good at sneaking away from responsibilities for private time with my queen. The servants are still finding some of our more creative hiding spots." She swatted his shoulder in mock reproach, though her own smile acknowledged the truth of his words. They'd worked hard to build something better than what came before, but they'd also learned to find joy in small moments and stolen hours. The weight of prophecy and duty would always be there, but so would their bond, stronger now than ever through years of partnership and shared challenges. "Come on," she said, taking his hand and leading him toward the door. "Arya will sleep another few hours at least. Let's take advantage while we can." Behind them, moonlight continued to stream through the nursery windows, bathing their daughter in silver glow that seemed almost prophetic itself. The future remained unwritten in specifics, full of challenges and choices yet to be made. But Alara and Kale faced it together as they always had, mates and partners and co-rulers of a kingdom they'd reformed through love and determination. Their strength had been tested by conspiracy, prophecy, and the weight of tradition. But it had proven unbreakable because it was built on trust and genuine partnership, rather than mere fate or supernatural bonds. Whatever came next, they would handle it the way they'd handled everything since that night, when an Omega's fear had awakened a sleeping king. Together, with courage and compassion, and the absolute certainty that they were stronger united than they could ever be apart. If you loved this journey of prophecy, partnership, and transformation, give this video a thumbs up and let me know in the comments what you thought of Alara and Kale's story. Should I create more content exploring the world they've built and the next generation growing up in their reformed kingdom? Don't forget to subscribe for more supernatural romance, stories that explore themes of power, choice, and the bonds that make us stronger together. Thank you for joining me for this epic tale, and I'll see you in the next story.